Welcome everyone to this learning session titled Understanding the Changes to the ArchivesSpace Agents module with Christine DeBella, ArchivesSpace Program Manager. Christine is the Program Manager for ArchivesSpace and is involved in all aspects of the program, working closely and collaboratively with the community, advisory groups, and governance board to set and implement the strategies and goals for ArchivesSpace. Christine has worked as an archivist for over 20 years in academic and nonprofit settings, including some where she created records about people, families, corporate entities in Archivist Toolkit, library catalogs, and word finding aids. In this session, she will highlight the major changes to the ArchivesSpace Agents module as of ArchivesSpace version 3.0, 3.01. So Christine, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jessica. And I want to say up front, for people that were here in the morning, I can promise that this is not going to be as fun and as life-changing as Valerie's session this morning, which was really wonderful. But one of our goals with these learning opportunities at the member forum this year was to give lots of people in the community a chance to kind of get on the same page as each other and sort of all have sort of the same base level of knowledge for certain kinds of things that they would be facing in their own institutions. So that's our goal that's my goal with this session right now. And I think Valerie did a wonderful job with that this morning with her session. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And some of you will definitely have heard some of these things before because we've had a few things on the Agents module over the course of the time that this was in development and in release. So if this is a repeat to you, I apologize for that, but also thanks for coming back to have it reinforced. So let's start my slideshow here. Okay, so here's what we're going to cover right now. Mostly we're going to be talking about the changes to the Agents module, but some of you might be kind of brand new to ArchivesSpace. We know that people come to the member forum with all sorts of different levels of expertise with ArchivesSpace. So I'll just briefly talk about what an agent is in ArchivesSpace. I'll talk about why we changed agents in ArchivesSpace. And then I'll talk about what you can do with agents in 3.x and higher versions of ArchivesSpace. And then talk a little bit about some tips for making the transition a little bit easier. So agents in ArchivesSpace. They describe people, families, and corporate entities like institutions, organizations, and conferences. They can link to any type of record in ArchivesSpace that describes archival material. So anything like an accession, a resource component, digital object component, all of those you can link agents to at any level. You can also link agents to classifications to be able to indicate the creator of parts of a record group structure. And you can link agents to events and assessments as part of recording actions that are taken with archival material. And then we'll talk about this a little bit in this webinar. You can also link agents to each other to indicate the relationships between different people, families, and corporate entities, and any combination of those. In ArchivesSpace, you create an agent record once, and then you can link to it many times. So this is a core concept of ArchivesSpace, that rather than having redundancy in data entry, you create a record once and then you use it in many different contexts within the application. When you link an agent to a type of record that describes archival material, the relationship to the material is defined as either a creator, a subject, or a source. And usually a source relationship is going to indicate a donor of material, but it's possible that there could be other things as well. And then that relationship can be further described if you have a more precise way that you want to describe the relationship beyond just a creator or just a subject. You can also use relator terms to indicate that level of precision. So a relator term might be something like a correspondent or a composer or a performer, things like that. You do that at the point that you're linking the agent to material. There are many different ways you can create agents in ArchivesSpace. You can create them one at a time within ArchivesSpace, within the interface itself, or you can create them in bulk using the API. You can bring them in through imports, either on their own as their own type of agent-specific record or a metadata record, or you can bring them in as parts of records that describe archival material. So you could have agents as part of an EAD record, for example, and those agents within an EAD record would create individual agent records within ArchivesSpace. And we also have built into ArchivesSpace, coming as part of the standard deployment of ArchivesSpace, the LCNAF plugin. And that's just one example of a mechanism for querying an external authority database and then bringing those records into ArchivesSpace as a one-time process. It is possible to develop other sorts of plugins to do that with other external authorities. So why did we go through all this change to make agents an expanded module, starting in versions that begin with 3 and forward? So the primary goals of the agents module expansion were really to come into greater compliance with metadata standards that are used to describe these kinds of things. So mainly MARC XML authority records and EAC CPF records. You can do all sorts of exciting things with those types of metadata standards. We wanted ArchivesSpace to be able to support that better. Facilitate better exchange with databases like LCNAF and social networks and archival context, SNAC, that many people participate in for describing persons, families, and corporate entities. We wanted to make it easier to exchange information between those types of databases and ArchivesSpace, especially since a lot of people use ArchivesSpace as their place of record, as the place that they really start in creating archival description, including about agent type things. And we wanted to be able to provide a way for people to be able to better contextualize agents. So being able to apply controlled access headings or information about the relationships of agents within ArchivesSpace, not just to material, or being able to do that within notes. So kind of in a nutshell, what can you do in ArchivesSpace 3x and higher related to agents? You get more subrecords and fields. You get more imports and exports for agents. And it also provides more opportunities to develop and refine your local practices about agents. So then drilling down into that, what does that encompass? I should say, you should know, of course, ArchivesSpace is very flexible. People use it all kinds of different ways. We've heard a lot about different kinds of flexible ways that people are using it over these last 3 days, as well as in general. You know that from one institution to the next, people use ArchivesSpace differently. And we wanted to definitely keep that kind of flexibility within agents as well. So even though this expansion, adds a lot to in terms of possibilities for what you can do in recording information about agents and their relationships, it doesn't add any more requirements for what you do. The requirements to make a valid agent remain really, really minimal. All you need to make a valid agent is an agent type, meaning whether it's a person or a family or corporate entity, or software is another type of agent we have. And you need one name form subrecord, one subrecord that provides the name essentially. So that's all you need to do to make a valid agent. We actually removed one of the requirements that had been there before. We relaxed that we relax the requirement to create source or rules in an agent record to make a valid agent record. That's because there are different ways to capture this in the new schema. We wanted to provide that flexibility. Some subrecords, definitely, if you want to actually use that subrecord, you're going to need to have, you're going to be required to create more information in there to make the subrecord value valid. But there's none of these new subrecords themselves that are required. And then kind of going along with needing to do more, if you actually want to create standards compliant data, the metadata, and you actually want to take advantage of these kinds of changes that we've made in ArchivesSpace to serve those goals that I mentioned, you are going to need to create more than the required fields. But you can determine whether that's something desirable to you based on your institutional context or your goals for that agent information. So one of the things that you'll notice if you move up to a new version of ArchivesSpace that has the expanded version of the agents module is that an agent record form is now divided into 5 sections. It's still all one now quite long form, but it's divided into different sections to kind of give a little bit of organization there, give a little bit of intellectual organization, help guide you a little bit through some of these new things. So it's divided into 5 sections, and I'll go through each of these sections in more detail. Basic information, record control information, identity information, description information, and relation information. And I'm just going to go to the old version of agents and the new version of agents just to visually show you what this looks like in terms of difference. So here's a pre-3 version of ArchivesSpace. Here's what the different parts of an agent record are in those versions. So you see it's relatively short. There's no kind of grouping in terms of larger organizational categories within it. But there's still a good amount of information you can create about agents there. But if you go into a 3 and higher version of ArchivesSpace, there's a lot more that you can do here. And the sidebar, if you're in edit mode of an agent, reflects that. And like I said, we'll go down into the detail of what all these different sections mean. But you'll see these sort of with gray in the background, those are the sort of the organizational groupings that are there. And then beneath those are the different subrecords. So going back. So the basic information section continues to be incredibly basic. The basic information section is only used to indicate the agent type. So person, family, corporate entity, or software, and whether the agent is published or not. And you're already making that determination of the agent type at the point that you select creating an agent. So the only thing you can change in the basic information section is this publish area. And nothing has changed about that section at all. Then we have a completely brand new section for record control information. This is information about the actual record, not about the thing that the record is describing. This is the information about the record itself. You can think of this maybe as like the hardcore like cataloger section of the record. There may be many people who actually, this section is not something that they're really considering using. But if you're wanting to share agent information with another system, or you're wanting to bring information in from another system, this might be a pretty important section to you. So this is the section that there's an expectation that there's some kind of exchange with another system happening with this record. Whether it comes in from another system, or it's going to go out to another system, or it's going to continue going back and forth. This section is one to record lots of information related to that. So this is the area that probably the most well, there's another area that has maybe a little bit more added, but this definitely has things that are brand new to ArchivesSpace in terms of the type of information that you're recording. So there's new subrecords for record IDs, so identifiers for the actual metadata record. You can record, as with any of these are repeatable subrecords. So record IDs in particular is one that might be especially helpful, that you can record multiple record IDs to reflect different systems that the record is coming from, or the different places that this record, a record about an agent lives, and link between them. Maintenance history, being able to record like all the different things that happened with the record, different ways that things were brought together from different databases. Now, I should say ArchivesSpace is still, our assumption is that ArchivesSpace is a system for archival description. It's a system used by archivists and people that work with archival materials. So you don't have every single bell and whistle that you might have in a library catalog system. Not every single mark field and subfield and indicator is something that you can record in ArchivesSpace down to the most granular level that you might be able to do in an actual library system. But there was a community specification to kind of pull together what were the things that were most likely to have relevance and be needed in ArchivesSpace for people that work on archival description of agents and want to be able to exchange it with other types of systems that may be in more of a regular bibliographic, or not in this case, not bibliographic, but authority cataloging type way that people work with things. So I will say that software does not have a record control section. Software, if you're familiar with the agent type of software in ArchivesSpace, you know that the software agent type is really primarily to be used in event records, and is really a type of agent record that is for ArchivesSpace only, is for recording information about things that happen in ArchivesSpace only, or things that relate to records and things that are done to them, maybe by systems outside of ArchivesSpace, but software doesn't actually have a corollary to an agent type, an authority record type outside of ArchivesSpace. So that's why it has a lot less. There's a lot less you can record in a software agent, and we did not add a record control section to software agents. One of the other things about this record control section and some of the changes that were made related to agents is we're also thinking sort of a little bit further ahead, and that there might be some other record types in ArchivesSpace that this information may be useful for. So it's starting out here in agents, and we think will probably get refined over time as people use this in production. But in theory, some of these types of subrecords could get applied to other record types in ArchivesSpace if people felt, if there was, community need for this type of information to be recorded for other types of records as well. The next section, it's given kind of a new name, but mostly it existed in ArchivesSpace before. This is the identity information section. This is really where you record the core information about the agent, him, her, themselves. The name form is part of this identity information section. And that was, again, the core of the original agents module in ArchivesSpace. It continues to be the core of what you're recording about agents in the expanded version, in the expanded agent module. One thing that did get added in this area is the ability to record an entity ID. So this would be an identifier that's not specific to the record, but is specific to the agent. It would be an ID that an agent might carry around with them from system to system. It might be something like, for example, an ORCID ID, something that is sort of like what describes a researcher that they can take around with them to their different published output, and would be a way for differentiating them from other people. We also have some new fields within the name form. All of the agent types now have a place where you can indicate the language, script, and transliteration of the name form itself, as well as parallel names with that name form. And then two of the name forms types of agents, there are some new fields on that type's name form. So for a family type of agent, agent type of family, you can indicate a family type as well as a location, say to distinguish the Smith family from Savannah, Georgia, from the Smith family from Los Angeles, California, things like that, that would differentiate one similar agent from another one. And then on a corporate entity, you could always record, you could always put a conference within ArchivesSpace, but you couldn't really, from the ArchivesSpace record itself, in a segmented way, indicate that something was a conference versus another type of corporate entity. So you can now do that, as well as a jurisdiction. And you can also, similarly, you can indicate the location where such things happened, or distinguish one corporate entity with a similar name from another using a location. There also some changes, and I'll mention this in a couple places. ArchivesSpace from the beginning had shared one date model for dates across the entire application. So whether they were dates that were part of an accession or a digital object or a person, the date subrecord, the format of it was the same across the application. This is another thing that we're pioneering with the agents dates, and that's the ability to record structured dates in a different way. And so those changes have also carried over to the name form. I'll talk a little bit more about dates of existence in a minute, but within the name form itself, you can record dates of name use. And so this no format for dates, for structured dates, is part of what you can do in dates of name use. Dates of existence. So people who are more hardcore catalogers will know that ArchivesSpace has been only applying the dates field in the name form to if there was an entry in there, that's what got appended to the display name in ArchivesSpace. And that's kind of the cataloging way of doing it, to differentiate one person from another person. You only need dates as part of that if you need to differentiate. So you don't have to proactively apply dates to the display of an agent name unless you need a person name, unless you need to differentiate them one from another. But archivists don't necessarily think that way. And so we had numerous requests that if there were dates of existence in an agent record, that those also get applied to the display name, and so that there was sort of consistency across the display of agent names. So we have made that now part of what's there, but we've also continued to provide a way that if you don't like the way the automatically generated display name shows up in ArchivesSpace, you can uncheck automatically generate for that name, and it will have your preferred and put in whatever is your preferred way to display it, and it will do that instead. This change to the display name of putting dates of existence in there is solely a display part. It doesn't change what happens in an export. So if you're exporting an agent record to a MARC catalog or to, you know, the library authority, large library authority database, you aren't going to get dates in there that aren't supposed to appear in that part. You're not going to get dates in a 100 that aren't supposed to appear there. It's solely for display within ArchivesSpace. Description information. So this, I guess, next to record control information, this is the other place where a lot of subrecords got added. This is where you can really provide further context about an agent. And this is where you can apply controlled access terms that are about the agent themselves, as opposed to controlled access terms that you would put on archival material that the agent has some kind of relationship with. And because you can apply controlled access terms to the agent as well as the archival material, there's also now a way you can bring together, you know, when you're browsing, when somebody is searching, they can get both. They can get results that are both relate to an agent as well as the archival material. So in this section, there are a number of new subrecords. One that we had a lot of questions about, and is certainly like something you'll want to consider what your local practice is going to be, is gender. So this is now something that you can record in ArchivesSpace if you want to. It's a configurable value list, but it does not ship with specific values or a specific controlled vocabulary, because we know that people do this differently in different contexts and would want to do this differently in different contexts. Many places may not want to record it at all. So it's a possibility that's in there, but it's by no means a requirement, and we're not mandating any kind of controlled vocabulary in there. If you import records into ArchivesSpace that have gender values in them, they will import into ArchivesSpace. So if you kind of don't like the values that you're seeing in there, or you feel limited by the values that you're seeing in there, you want to build out the controlled vocabulary in ArchivesSpace to have the values that you want for your controlled vocabulary, or you're going to want to look at those imports. And if that is a piece of information that you don't want to have, you could either do a custom import for those, or you could, you know, have like a regular process for cleaning up that data. You can also record places, so geographic subterms related to an agent. You can specify them with certain kinds of roles, like place of birth or residence or place of death. You can record information about occupations, so occupation subject terms related to the agent. Functions, so in the archival sense, a function, or in the cataloging sense, a function related to the agent. Topics, so anything that's sort of like a more general topical term. And you can also indicate languages used by the agent or associated with the agent. So this would not be the language of the record, the cataloging record, the archival description record. This would not be the language of that the name form is recorded in. This is actually like languages that the agent uses or does business in. All of these are repeatable. Within the existing subrecords in ArchivesSpace, there's just a little bit of change here in the description information section, because most of it was new. Contact details is now like a little bit more robust. So in addition to being able to record like the usual things about address and you know, different ways to contact somebody, you know, and this is repeatable, of course, so multiple contacts associated with the agent record. You can also now record a little bit more like information related to the different contacts that you have with an agent, record a, you know, date information about when it happened, and notes, like give that a little bit more structure than it had in previous versions of ArchivesSpace. So if you're somebody who has, this would primarily probably be something that you would do with donors and donor interactions. This would be a way to give that a little bit more structure each time that you're in contact with the donor. You might want to, you know, create another contact notes subrecord for that interaction. And then, as I mentioned, we have this new structured date model in ArchivesSpace. These structured date models, reflect changes that that EAC CFF and EAD3 have related to dates. So in this, you can record not just begin and end dates, not just begin and end standard dates, but also begin and end dates for a date expression. You can also indicate whether a particular standard date actually means that date, or it means not before that date or not after that date, as well as all the flexibility that you had before in ArchivesSpace to indicate things like approximate, how much certainty there was, whether something was approximate, what calendar it had, it is part of, those kinds of things. Within description information, there's now a lot more you can do with notes and subnotes in ArchivesSpace. You may remember in there, you may know, because you're looking at it right now, in earlier versions of ArchivesSpace, there was essentially just one note that you could put on an agent. You could put a biographical historical note on agents, and you could there was one note type that was actually not supposed to be there for rights, and we have finally removed that. You can also now do some more things with general context for things, for a corporate entity with legal status and mandate, with families and corporate entities. You can do a note that's more related to like the structure or genealogy in the case of a family. There are the kinds of subnotes that you find in other places in the application, where you can give, within a subnote, give it a little bit more structure in terms of lists and outlines. The last section in the expanded version of agents is the relationship section of where you can indicate relationships between different agents and material that's either inside or outside ArchivesSpace. And of course, this is, being able to really contextualize things and indicate relationships, because often materials related to a particular person or family, they're held at many different archival repositories. So being able to do that, not just within a note, but also in a little bit more structured way within ArchivesSpace, add some value to ArchivesSpace and to the kinds of description you can do in there. So we have one new subrecord in ArchivesSpace for related external resources. So this is the place, if it's something not held by your institution, but held by another institution, this is a place where you can record some information related to that. For things that are actually in ArchivesSpace, you can still link to them from when you create that link between archival material and the agent, and you're indicating whether they're the creator, subject, or source, that automatically creates a link to the agent record. So that's still the way to record information about resources that are actually in ArchivesSpace. And then there's a little bit more complexity to what you can do in recording relationships in the related agents section. So there's a few more types of relationships that you can indicate there. You can also describe a relationship, like a family relationship. You could also describe it with some more precision if you wanted to. You can build out a controlled vocabulary for this. We're not mandating a specific vocabulary for those more precise descriptions of relationships, but you can build that out however you like, or you can bring it in from an external source. But different ways to indicate that two people are related to each other, or a family and a person are related to each other, or a family and an organization are any combination you can think of. There's a little bit more you can do that, a little more complexity in what you can do with related agents here. And some of these things, you may recognize, like, these are important things to be able to do if you are working in SNAC. If that's part of what you do, you want to contribute relationships to SNAC, or you want to bring records in from SNAC. These are the kinds of things that, there's exciting possibilities for what you can do. And we're supporting more of that in ArchivesSpace now. So that's all the stuff about like the actual metadata. That's all about what you can record in an agent record. And then there's a little bit that came in also in terms of additional functionality that's not just information that you can record in an agent record. So we did flesh out some things related to imports and exports. There wasn't before, there's now a standalone MarkXML authority import and export. So if you have just an authority record and all the detailed information that comes from an authority record, you can bring it into ArchivesSpace as that. And you can also similarly, if you have an agent record in ArchivesSpace, you can export it in MarkXML authority format. Also, if you were familiar with the EAC CPF import and export in ArchivesSpace before, you'll know that it was pretty limited, in part because ArchivesSpace was pretty limited, and what you could capture related to an agent didn't necessarily reflect all the things that you can do in EAC CPF. So now those are much more fleshed out compared to what they were before. And then some of this functionality was built or made more robust in ArchivesSpace as part of the earlier stages of this agents module expansion. But now it's probably, some things that, you want to take advantage of a little bit more, possibly related to agents. So, adding all the things that you can now record in agent records, adding that to the edit required fields functionality, adding that to the edit default values functionality. And then, it happened a while ago, but again, in part because of the earlier stage of this project, as well as just adding all the information that is now possible. That sort of more robust version of the agent merge, where you can compare two records side by side before merging them. So there's a lot more information you can record in ArchivesSpace now about an agent. If you use the public interface, it's probably important to you that that be reflected in the public interface as well. So kind of the public facing pieces of that are now also reflected in the public user interface. The entire record control information section is not part of that. The only part of the record control information section that will appear on the public user interface in some circumstances is the record identifiers. But by and large, the new things that got added to ArchivesSpace are also things that will appear on public user interface records. So that's about all the things that you can do. It sounds like a lot. It is a lot. So we know that this upgrade, might be take a little bit more consideration than some upgrades do, when an upgrade just involves, some bugs that are going to get fixed or some nice functionality that's got added. This is a place where, a whole schema for one of the record types in ArchivesSpace changed. So this is one you might want to sort of map out a little bit more, depending on how important agents are to you. You may be a place that, as a rule, hasn't really been creating agents, or really only creates an agent, for the creator of a collection or something like that. That's perfectly fine, of course. But in that kind of situation, this might not be that big of a change to you. You can continue working that way, or you can, now with this change, work differently, but it will mean, like, from a legacy standpoint, you don't have to think about quite so much. But if agents are important to you, or they're going to be important to you in the new version, I figure there's some things that you'll probably want to think about to make the transition a little bit easier. So first and foremost, I would say definitely consider, and if you can, formalize your local practices. So review these changes. that have been made, and work out, of these many things that are now possible, which subrecords and fields you're typically going to use or will want to use, and what you won't. And if you can, formalize that in documentation. If you have legacy data, definitely do a test migration. If you can, do multiple test migrations and review the results if you can. That's going to be, as I say here and just said, especially important if you already have a lot of agents. Work out a data cleanup strategy if the migration exposes issues and differences in your data. It may very well. Now, we had one situation where after the release happened, some people did some test migrations at that point, and they noted some things about the actual migration itself that were not just undesirable for them, but for, certain ways that people work with agents, if they had a lot of dates of existence, were going to be undesirable. So we're actually putting out a new version of this migration that changes that up a little bit, and is going to be helpful for certain kinds of situations. Again, really only if you use dates of existence a lot. And are concerned about, and if you were using dates of existence and you had both standard dates and you had dates of expression, and you're concerned about, how that mapped into the new structured date model. So we're open. We're not going to be changing this migration again and again and again, but we were open to making that change based on feedback. But by and large, what the migration is after this next version is what the migration is going to be. So do some test migrations. And if you see that information is migrating differently, or it's exposing some holes or differences within your data because you never had things there before, work out a data cleanup strategy for that. And you can't do this all at once, of course. So consider an iterative data cleanup or enhancement project to take advantage of these new changes, especially, again, if agents are important to you or they're likely to become more important to you as a result of these changes and possibilities. We have put away in ArchivesSpace to sort of pretend that this doesn't exist for the time being. You can't completely pretend this doesn't exist because the data schema for agents is changing for everybody. But there are some ways to change the view that a particular user sees and make it dependent on some permissions and dependent even on personal choice. You can change it sort of as a short-term thing. You can change it, for quite a while. You can decide what you want to do. So we have something called light mode. Light mode is a staff interface view of agents that has fewer fields and subrecords. It's mostly, when you look at it at ArchivesSpace in light mode, it's going to look, an agent record is going to look pretty similar to the pre-3 versions of ArchivesSpace. It's only related to the display in the staff interface. It doesn't impact the imports, the exports, or the view in the public interface. As I said, the schema change is the same for everyone. If there's data in fields, those fields, that data is going to be reflected in the imports and the exports and the view in the public interface for all users. But if you want to sort of hide that or make it like easier for people that need sort of a more streamlined view of agents, because maybe they don't work with agents very often, or maybe they only do certain types of things with agents, or maybe you as an institution are not yet ready, you want to upgrade, but you're not yet ready to kind of work out the details of how you're going to use all these new things. We have this light mode to help people kind of continue to work in a more streamlined way for the time being. Light mode is keyed into a permission in the application. There's a new permission that's been added. It's at the very bottom of the list. It's called Work with Agents in Full Mode. It's off by default for users that are below the archivist level. If you think about those built-in permission groups in ArchivesSpace, if people are in a permission group, a built-in permission group below archivists, they're not going to have this permission by default when you upgrade. But you can give it to any permission group you like. If you have custom permission groups, you can add this to any custom group. But to be able to change modes and to be able to work with agents in full mode, this permission needs to be part of what a user has access to. The light mode checkbox is sticky. This is it's on the toolbar. Let me see if I can pull up my thing here. So here's an example of an agent in the new version of ArchivesSpace and an upgraded version of ArchivesSpace. You'll see that, so I'm a user that has permission to do things, do agents in full mode. You'll see there on the toolbar here at the far left, there's a checkbox there to do light mode or to work in full mode. It's not checked, so right now I'm in full mode. If I check it, I'll be in light mode and you see a whole bunch of stuff over here goes away. It doesn't change what happens if I go into view mode of this record. All those things are still here. And that's consistent with the ArchivesSpace overall, in that if there's data in a field, it appears on view mode. But if I'm in edit version, if I'm in edit mode of a record, I do have these two different choices. You'll see it was sticky, it stayed there. If I went to a different record, I would still be in light mode. If I went to create a new record, I'm not in light mode right now, but I would be. Anyway, pretend that I am in light mode. Sorry, live demo, always something happens. Okay, so yeah, so it's sticky. Once that's set, you stay in that mode for the user unless it's changed by checking or unchecking. Now, in a system administrator does have access to full mode the whole time, but they can check light mode to get to that more compacted view, and it will stay compacted. And like I said, if there's data in fields, those will appear in view mode. But so a user might be able to see data in view mode that they can't change. So you want to think, this is another thing, like think about your practices, who should have full mode, who should have light mode? Does anybody, is anybody working in the new version, the new expanded module of Agents module of ArchivesSpace for the time being? Think about that and apply the permissions that way. As you know, within ArchivesSpace, this is consistent within ArchivesSpace across the system, there are tooltips, or some people call them rollovers. If you hover over the label for a field or the label for a subrecord, you get this black box with information about what that field is for. These are completely customizable. So, there are generic tooltips that come with ArchivesSpace out of the box, provide some information about what that field is for in an overall general context. But if you want to get more specific, for how you're using that field locally, or sort of calling out to your users, use this field, then you can customize the tooltips. There's some information about how to do that in the linked from the ArchivesSpace user manual and also in the technical documentation that's freely available to anyone. So because this is a new expanded version of agents, there's a whole lot more there. As you're going through and formalizing your practices and thinking about what documentation you're going to have related to them to share with your users, or even, if your only user is yourself and you're the only one that's working in the staff interface for ArchivesSpace, it still may be useful to provide that kind of, reminder to yourself of what you're using and where it goes. The tooltips, customizing the tooltips may be really helpful for that. The functionality, I mentioned that one of the expansions of functionality that came in, a few versions ago as part of this project overall was the ability to edit required fields. Now, what that means is beyond the minimal number of fields that are required in ArchivesSpace to make a valid agent, you can set additional fields that are required locally. So if you always want the record control identifier type to be something that your users need to fill out, then you can set that as an additional required field. A record won't save, an agent record, a new agent record won't save in ArchivesSpace until that requirement has been met. The user would be prompted to fill out that field on saving the record. Default values, so not as restrictive as required fields, but in the case of default values, you actually get to supply data if you want to. So default values may be another area that you want to make more liberal use of than you were using before related to agents, because if you have something that's going to be consistent across all your agents, or maybe not every single one of your agents, but frequently across agents, or some people use default values to the kind of thing I was describing with the tooltips, kind of calling out to people, calling out to their users, you need to put something here. And so that kind of thing. So default values may be really helpful in this new context for the agents module in ArchivesSpace. So I'm getting down to the end here. Maybe I'll go into the Q&A, and if there's any, and Jessica, if there's anything in the chat, if you could call that out that is a question, you can call that out for me before I get into like wrapping up the entire thing. So Brianna says, with so many new fields available, because you speak to how to avoid duplicate agents, the same agent name with and without any of the record control information fields filled in. You have a decision tree encouraging users to browse or search for agents before creating one. But I'm curious how others are managing it. And I'm hoping when I click show all, people have great advice. So yes, so Kate, yeah, in her experience, most duplicates are created not by hand, but by ingest. I think this is very, yes, I agree. That's very much the case. There are some things that are checked when imports happen to try and identify whether something is the same as something that already exists in the system. If those things that are checked, there's something called a hash that like puts different parts of the agent record together and compares it to agents that are already there. And if all those things are exactly the same, then it will not create a new one. But if all those things aren't exactly the same, it will. So the agent merge is a way to like get down to that at the end. Do people here have advice though for how to ensure that you're differentiating enough between agents so that you're not getting duplicates? There's certainly obviously cataloging practices to differentiate, by adding dates to something or adding locations to something, being consistent in how you do that, all of those kinds of things. I'll move on, and if people have things, to put into the chat, please do.
Christine.
Yep.
Since you started addressing the Q&A, another question unrelated has popped up. What is the default display of the new, exciting, and robust agent record in the PUI?
So in the PUI, the default is basically, so as I said, light mode does not impact imports, exports, or display in the public user interface. So the default is to show everything in an agent that is public information, whether it's in full mode or light mode. So if there's data in those fields that are part of, what got added, so what's essentially full mode, those will be in the public user interface. So if you don't want those as part of the, what's on the public user interface, you need to make sure that there's no data, there's no data in those fields. Okay, anything else before I move on? And this is almost the end, so.
There's another question in the Q&A. Natalie asks, we have issues with imported agents with extremely minimal data, very hard to differentiate. I would like to encourage archivists only to create agent records when they have sufficient info to identify a person and differentiate them from someone with the same name.
Natalie calling out the archivists. I hear that though. Yeah, absolutely. So it's easy to so yeah, it's very, and of course, like a lot of times, with archival materials, you don't have a whole lot of information. Like you might just know a last name or a first name even, and you don't know very much. And part of, the excitement of doing archival research is being able to flesh that out and find more information. But yes, it's really easy to do. And we try to have, as I said, in ArchivesSpace, we tried to make the merging functionality a little bit more robust, so that when you encounter those situations where you find two agents that are really the same person, and it becomes clear that it's the same person, that you're able to take care of that. But yeah, I think it's also a good idea to be judicious about, when you create agents, and certainly when you link to agents to archival material. Okay. So yeah, so this project definitely, it was challenging. It was very challenging. This was so ArchivesSpace came out in 2013. It was many years in the making before 2013, working off of specifications. Well, if you think even earlier, specifications that were based on how record schemas worked in Archivist Toolkit and Archon. So this was the first time we did, like, not just adding a couple fields or a couple subrecords to one of the major record types in ArchivesSpace. This was an overhaul of a major record type. So it was complex. It was complex to get here. And there were many, many people involved. And I don't have a lovely slide today, thanking everybody who wrote or reviewed the specification or the code, provided ideas and feedback and testing. But suffice it to say, you can go back to my release notes and announcements and all kinds of other things that we've done, and see that. But suffice it to say, it was many people that were involved and did testing. And so it certainly, pointed some do's and don'ts for processes going forward, when we get to the points that we look at overhauling major record types again. But that doesn't mean we don't, progress. Doesn't mean ArchivesSpace doesn't progress. We just know how complex it is to get there, and really appreciate everybody that was involved. We do. We know that it doesn't end. We all know in ArchivesSpace, in archives, not just ArchivesSpace, nothing ever ends, right? So we expect that as people work with this expanded agents module in production, we definitely expect that there's going to be changes that people want. They realize, something that in theory seemed like it would work doesn't really work, or if you're working with it all the time, needs to be different. You know, that could be a display thing, that could be an import-export thing, that might even be a schema thing. But anyway, we expect that as people are really in there working with agents a lot, as they're working with their legacy agent information a lot, that they're going to see things that maybe not even just for themselves, but kind of community-wide, people think should be changed. So we definitely expect that to happen. As always, we welcome your feedback. We welcome the creation of JIRAs related to that. We especially welcome community discussion of those things and people getting together to sort of hash out before kind of proposing something, kind of hashing out something that kind of has its good amount of buy-in across the community. But as always, there's so many great things that we could be doing. So any additional work on agents is going to need to be balanced with the many other types of things that people want. And not just sort of adding really great fun things to the application, but also the maintenance of the underlying infrastructure of the application. So there's lots of things, there's lots of places where you can go for more help. The user manual, the user documentation sub-team did a really great job of putting together documentation related to these changes to agents and how agents actually work now. You can still get documentation related to how they worked prior to 3.0. So don't worry if you're on an older version of ArchivesSpace and you're not going to get here for a while. There's still good documentation for you to consult on how to work with agents. But there's this new great stuff too. There's also video tutorials related to these changes. I think Malaka Kotman was the person who recorded those. If you've heard Malaka's teaching or training or videos before, you know she's quite thorough. And also comes to these things from the perspective as a cataloger. So there's good videos there. We also have community trainings coming up. The next community training, that the more basic training, will reflect these changes in the agents module. So the part about agents that is taught in there will reflect these changes. And then we did do, and Corey Neimer and Alex Durhey and I did an introductory webinar way back in January, feels like a long time ago now, about these changes when they were coming, not released. So you can go back and watch that. Corey and Alex did a great job in sort of contextualizing from a wider archives perspective why these are valuable and some different ways that they and people and organizations that they work with are intending to use them. And that's it. That is all I have. So I'll stop here and ask if there are questions, thoughts, anything that people would like to discuss in the last 25 minutes of our member forum for 2021.
Currently nothing in the chat or the chat or the Q&A, but that doesn't mean people aren't typing furiously.
And if you're not, that's fine too. And we will have 24 minutes back in our afternoons.
Could you, Christine, if I'm going to stop sharing again, could you just pull up your last slide and let that sit on the screen?
I can, just a second.
And we'll make sure we share slides with the recording that goes up on the wiki after the fact. Is there a way to choose or edit what parts of an agent record get displayed in the PUI?
So it would be the same as anything else in ArchivesSpace right now. If you want to customize the display of the PUI, you would need to do a plugin or you would need to change the code.
No other questions coming up. And I'm not sure if I already said it or not, but I did drop in the chat a link to the release if you're interested in it. So if you would like to go ahead and download the release, there's a link in the chat for that. Can these new fields be added to the bulk importer?
The spreadsheet importer. So there, well, the thing about the spreadsheet importer is it is the agent's information there is about the linking of an agent to archival material. So there's very minimal information about agents in there. I don't know, honestly. I mean, in theory, like an agent is a linked subrecord. You can put things about linked subrecords in the spreadsheet importer, but they're all in the context of that archival material. So anything's possible in theory. It's not the intended purpose of that spreadsheet importer, I would say. But you can always file a JIRA, see if there's other people that are interested.
Thanks. So there's no publish tick boxes for the new subnotes?
So there are just the way you can publish notes. So most of the new notes are using the notes model of the actual like notes. Let me pull this up actually. So most of the new notes are using the notes model of ArchivesSpace. And so they do have publish and unpublished, well, publish, not unpublished. So they do have a publish box. And subnotes do as well. So they do. There's the subrecords themselves, though. The subrecords do not have publish or unpublished boxes. Mostly because they're either the record control information, which is not published at all, or they're like these things down in the description information section. They are subject headings essentially, and subject headings in ArchivesSpace do not have publish or unpublish. Now, John, maybe if you're talking about the notes that you can add to a subject heading, then I see. These also do have publish and unpublish. So it is possible to put certain types of information that you add as a result of this expansion of the agents module. It is possible to keep some of that away from the public user interface and keep it out of exports.
All right. For those of you that aren't keeping up in the Q&A box, there any questions that have been answered by Christine have moved over to the answered section, and some people are responding there on those with their own insights. So there's a little additional conversation happening there, so be sure to check that out.
I expect that this might be the kind of thing, because this is, again, like this is a major change in ArchivesSpace. It might not be a change. It certainly isn't a change that probably impacts everybody equally, because some people use agents a lot. Some people haven't gotten there yet. Some people are never going to get there because, you know, recording this kind of information is not part of, you know, central to what they do. But I could certainly see this being the kind of thing that in future forums or future webinars, we revisit more from the user perspective of how people have implemented that. So maybe this time next year, we'll hold a place on the program for hearing from a number of different users about how they implemented it. And I think that's probably going to be what's most interesting to people, is learning from each other about, you know, how they made this change, how they adapted it, how they're taking advantage of the possibilities that this affords.
Sarit says, I opened a ticket for an additional column in the search and browse with this new agent module. Might that call for even more fields being available to view?
So search and browse in terms of when you're on in search and browse for an agent. Let me just, again, let me pull this up to make sure we know what you're talking about. The JIRA ticket, I'm sure, explains it, but.
Yes, Sarit says yes.
Okay, so in terms of right now, there are fairly limited things that you can see. And sorry, Kate, if you didn't want everyone to know that you created this in the sandbox. Yeah, so in terms of being able to add more and in preferences, being able to choose from more of them. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly worth considering as a feature request. It'd be great to hear from other people on that ticket about whether that's something they think they might want to do, and what, and I guess more specifically, what fields they would want to be there. We're certainly running out of real estate, so I don't know if we could have more columns than 7 there, but there certainly could be other kinds of things that you could see in there if there were enough community interest in that. And, you know, of course, again, balancing with the resources that we have and the other kinds of things that people want.
We're all caught up in the Q&A, so I'm going to speak very slowly to give people a last.
This is the most suspenseful part, just to see if anyone is typing anything.
But we've had a couple people chat us to say, yes, Christine, they want to see at the next forum, they would love to see a session on how other institutions are using the new agents module. So I think just based on the discussions that we have had over this forum, I think the next forum might be planned. I mean, we've had so many good
ideas. I know, I don't think, you know, it's all booked. We're hoping next year that we will be back in person, and next year SAA is in Boston, which is close to where I live. I live in the suburbs, but in Boston. So we're hoping for an in-person forum next year. But our virtual programming is not going to go away either. But yeah, I think we got the whole thing set.
We're done. All right. But yeah, lots of great conversations happened during this forum, which I think is wonderful, especially considering how long we've been apart and that we were doing it all virtually. I definitely learned a lot. I learned a lot about what other people are doing at their institution. So I think that's really exciting. Thank you all for staying until the bitter end of the forum. We are going to go ahead and wrap things up now. And if we don't see you at an SAA event throughout the rest of the week, I look forward to seeing you at the next ArchivesSpace event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.